Hey everyone, welcome to the first episode in a new series of the Forester's Forecast, where I interview master's and PhD students in forestry. If you didn't know, the Forester's Forecast is dedicated to the memory of my former advisor, Dr. Harold Burkhart. Dr. Burkhart was an amazingly selfless human being who dedicated his life to teaching and mentorship. I cannot think of a better way to honor his memory than to give graduate students a platform to showcase their work. Now, today's episode takes us on a little bit of a road trip. I'm currently in Bogota, Colombia, where the elevation is just a little over 9,000 feet. If you see me struggling to breathe or I misspeak, it's completely due to the lack of oxygen. Also, my guest today hails from Sweden. Carl Vigren is a PhD student at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences in the Department of Forest Resource Management. Now, Carl has an amazing list of achievements in his PhD, and I highly suggest that everybody check out his GitHub page. We had a wonderful conversation talking about everything from the standardization and the documentation of historical growth models, all the way to the integration of remotely sensed data into growth and yield systems. I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I did. Please help me welcome the soon-to-be Dr. Carl Vigren. Hey, Carl, welcome to the Forester's Forecast, my first episode that is about, grad student spotlight. I'm really happy to have you here, and
It's a pleasure to be here, Nick.
you're my first international guest, and I have to tell you, since you and I have been, talking through email and through LinkedIn, I've been so excited about the things you're working on, and I'm really excited that you get to share this with everyone else so they can be just as excited as I am.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
So first off, again, I'm just interested in, how people tick, how they work, why they're interested in forestry. So could you just give us a bit of a background about yourself and why you got into the profession?
Oh, well, I think in my case it's rather easy because I had an international upbringing. We were moving around a lot. And then once we came home back to Sweden, out to my kind of countryside, not a farm, but we have a house. And I kind of felt that although I was very academic, I kind of felt a bit misplaced when you're out in the countryside and you're not really of good use. You don't have a good wrench hand, and you wanted to find a way of grounding yourself and connecting to both your local environment, but also the people around you and feeling like you belong. So I think that's really how forestry came to me.
Mhm.
Um, and seeing how Washington Post's labor statistic seemed to indicate that it was one of, at least for US, one of the highest ranked professions in terms of the self-reported happiness levels and lowest amounts of stress, that seems to be a good decision.
Yeah, I guess especially in Sweden, I mean, you're pretty much a whole country of forest. It's, probably a huge profession there.
Yeah, we employ a lot of people. We do, but in terms of foresters with at least a master's degree, I think the old number was something around 2,000 people working out on somewhere around 24 million hectares
Wow.
of productive forest land, of 28 of when you include everything else. So it's a rather large place,
Yeah, yeah.
but it's not a continent.
No, but it is still quite, I mean, compared to the population of Sweden, I mean, it's quite a lot of forestry jobs and a lot of forest industry there. I know in my time in Norway, when I was able to visit Sweden, it was just, it was like coming back home for me a little bit to the US because of such a industrial forest.
Yeah, yeah, it's a different thing, and then there's a remarkable difference moving from north to south, also in terms of moving away from the high latitude, high altitude areas where you can see the tree line, and then moving down through the birch forests, and that gets replaced by these old growth spruce forests, and then you
Mhm.
have the more monocultural plantations kind of coming in, and then gradually a shift down into the hemiboreal or nemoboreal zones in the south of Sweden. So
Yeah.
it's a wide variety.
Yeah, I have to admit that when I was in Norway, I was working on thinning. So whenever I came to Sweden, I was visiting the southern monocultures where you were doing a lot of thinning. So I was just going for ideas because for me, moving from the southern U.S. from a 25-year rotation to Norway where it's an 80-year or 100-year rotation, and then
Yeah.
trying to come up with ideas to implement thinning. Of course, I needed to go next door to the neighbors and see what you guys are doing.
I think we can get down to perhaps not 80 years, but we'll keep it 80 to 110 just to keep it easy. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's a whole different story.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about some of the research that you're doing. I'm really impressed by your kind of CV and your dissertation and all the things you're doing in your PhD. But the reason you and I got connected is that I had developed a growth model for thinning in monocultures of spruce in Norway. And then you are developing a GitHub where you're collecting all of these forestry functions and you're coming up with a standardized way to put them all together. So, really, just tell us what you're doing and all about that.
Oh, sure. Well, just for those who don't know, GitHub is kind of like an online platform and a place for you to store and have version control and perhaps work in teams with your code. So when you have a really large code base, it really helps you get an overview. So I think Microsoft bought it from the original creators sometime 2008 for an obscene amount of money, and since then they've done really great things. So I was very happy to jump aboard that ship and say that I really enjoy the way that you can use and utilize it to both store your code and look through it and share it. Above all, I think it's important that we make our research known not only in the research world or in terms of our research papers, but also in terms of suggested implementations and actual comments and how it's meant to be put together. That really kind of works out in the long run. I've come to see, at least when looking at my own research, that you spend a lot of time trying to dig in and trying to find out exactly how does this work, what did they modify from the research paper, why aren't they doing it this way, when are they recalculating the quadratic stem diameters, and so on. All of that kind of thing seems to get lost in your average paper.
Yeah, for sure. And some things just slip through the cracks. And you have given me a great example because in the paper that I published on my thinning models, I used log base 10 as the indicator for natural log where I should have used natural log. And it had took me to read your code in the Forester GitHub to know that I had made that mistake and nobody else caught it. So I had to send a quick email to the Scandinavian Journal of Forest Research and say like, "Hey guys, I made this mistake and nobody's caught it until now."
At least that's not so bad. I think we'd all be, if we really got into the nitty gritty, trying to replicate documents that you find, everyone makes errors, and I think that this is just one way in which we will kind of, both as a academic discipline, grow and can find these before they kind of get any larger, if you will. And
Yeah,
I think that keeping our source code open and available and for everyone to see and comment on or improve on is a key feature for me, at least. And I think we found that I figured out after quite a long while in our own support system, which has, I mean, a lot of people working on it here in Sweden. I think we're a team of about 10 or 12 people only working with that decision support system uh,
mhm.
called Eureka. Um, and I mean, every now and then something slips through, especially when you're using or combining a lot of legacy code or old growth models and you want to combine them into a support system that can facilitate transitions between different species or all sorts of things that these models were not necessarily intended to do.
Mhm.
And then you start modifying things, and these build up over a while, and in the end it becomes very hard to follow. Or and that's when it's good to have these kind of repositories. You can just do a quick lookup and say, hey, where does this 3.1415
Yeah.
coefficient come from?
Right.
Who came up with this, or why did we? Can we search through and see which growth model had exactly this coefficient? And
Right.
turns out we could. So
Yeah.
that was a nice saver, and it saves time in the end, I guess, even though it's a bit of a pain to put together.
Yeah, and it is, I think, an amazing endeavor. I'm sure, I mean, you can to attest to the amount of time that it takes to put something like this together because as you're trying to interpret other people's work, and sometimes those other people are not around anymore to help you interpret their own work. So you really kind of have to make a good estimate of what they're doing. And sometimes that's quite difficult.
Yeah, or at least and you have to make a decision on how true do you want to stay to what you think they have done and
Mhm.
what you think should have been done, if you think that they're going on a road that you perhaps may not have recommended, as you start to get more comfortable in your own discipline, or in my case, the growth and yield. Then,
Yeah, and one thing that I wanted to ask you in putting all this together, because I'm also a systems builder. My systems are not quite as intense as something like Eureka, but whenever you're putting this together and you're bringing models from different places, well, sometimes that decision support system is going to be used on data. It's going to be used to extrapolate outside of the range of those models that were, the data for fitting those models, right? But
yeah,
that doesn't necessarily get translated into the decision support system. And so one of the things that I think about is climate. So we use a lot of
yeah,
these decision support systems to model different climate scenarios. But the data that those models were used for fitting, that those data don't necessarily translate to the same climate scenarios that we're projecting. So mm, I think there needs to be a disclaimer that comes with that kind of stuff. But I'm really curious your thoughts, not just on climate, but in general, that kind of scenario when putting together a decision support system.
right. I think that in terms of that, we have to think of this from two perspectives. I mean, we both have an academic background, so we'd really like to focus on the whole. Oh, you really shouldn't do that with this model, uh, and where it's actually a good enough engineering solution, which I think kind of reflects in many of the older models, especially when you start going back to before the 1940s, or you start getting into the really somebody has made a quite simple regression, or if they have made a regression at all, or if it's just a summary of geographic information that kind of amounts to a yield table. Then
Mm,
uh, and you can see that they also have, especially when they started developing regression models, they had a lot of thoughts about this, and were quite concerned about the whole. We have temporary plots, and we are now trying to connect these in a series that we would like to use as if we were projecting a stand.
mm.
Is this truly what we are doing, or are we actually doing something else in a statistical sense? What are we actually trying to do? Even though we might connect it with a thinning response that may be followed up from repeat measurements, but what are we doing with this type of a longitudinal analysis? And I think when we start combining these, it really kind of grows quite rapidly. And my best guess for what we were going to do moving forwards will be not only to try to uh, get a better grip on how we handle errors or projections, as you mentioned. I think that we do have to have a better understanding of how uncertainty propagates through our models, and what we can do to make our decisions as sound as possible in
Mhm.
terms of our projection length, or when we perhaps need to go out and get more data in the field, or perhaps when we need to evaluate whether we should update a model, because all of that's very costly in the end of the day.
Right.
Even if you're working on a national scale with, as in Sweden, we have quite a lot of cooperative efforts between our forest companies that come together, and still, I mean, you want to get the best bang for buck.
Yeah. And something that you had mentioned to me before that relates to this is that uh, it, whenever we base our models on very well manicured trials, and then we're using
Yeah.
those models to model at a national scale, well, those responses don't necessarily translate, right?
Right. So for some background to what Mickey mentioned here, we were actually discussing just very briefly uh, what the impact or the meaning of measuring completely undamaged stands, that is the stand that has been uh, serendipitously uh, avoided all types of damages, all disease, all windbreaks, all kind of these um, failed plantings. All of these things don't necessarily translate very well into our models. And we were discussing should, when we look at a yield table and we say, is it really reasonable to say that, oh, you should probably expect the best possible outcome for your stand, or should we rather try to introduce some sort of disclaimer or some other point estimate that rather points towards what you might expect given an average amount of um, damages, for example, from storm? I
Yeah.
mean, that's become very clear to us in Sweden since we've had a couple of strong storms come in from the Atlantic, and I think you have the same down in the south of US, uh, where we really have to start thinking about how these affect our management and our management routines.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely with changing climate or differences in climate, we're seeing an uptick of hurricanes in the southeastern U.S. and definitely there is a lot of work going on right now to incorporate risk from climate damages in Sweden now due to climate changes. You're seeing upticks in storms and in beetle damage. What's going on there?
Well, as if with everything, I think we need to take that with a grain of salt.
Mhm.
We have to separate what is due to climate change, what is due to our management. And I think that one of the things that we tend to do is that because we have quite long rotations, and we have had quite large storms in the past, there is a certain amount of synchronicity at the landscape level, and we have during the last 50 years or so built up a rather large reserve of standing stock. So I think that may very well be a natural response to that, that there is a lot of substrate for these bark beetles. I don't know if you have them in the US also, Ips typographus.
Yeah.
Um,
We have
that,
ips. I don't know if we have that particular species of ips, but we do have ips. Yes.
yeah, uh, who are well, who can move around and find quite a lot of substrate at the landscape level. So then that in combination with certain storm damages may just tend to compound these damages and cause a lot of wood value to be lost. But I hear that there's a lot up and coming on how to salvage also this type of wood that may not be fit entirely for your average construction lumber, but may not need to be treated as paper pulp just because of a few or rather large damages from beetles.
Right. Yeah, and I think you make a good point in the change in the management because I think especially in Europe, management has been changing quite a bit over the past 100 years, and so you see quite a bit of differences in the forest structure. And of course, this is all over the literature. You can look and see the European changes over the past 100 years in many different papers, right? And separating out those management effects and the climate effects can be a bit tricky, right? Because while the management changing, you're also seeing in the past 40 years, I know in Norway, the main part of the growing season has almost doubled, right? And so if the summers are getting warmer and a bit longer, and you're seeing a bit more insect and diseases, is that due to your changing forest structure or to your changing climate or both? And how do you kind of get those little details out in a model?
Sure would be difficult for a natural experiment.
Yeah, right, right.
But
I
no,
think especially
I've
yeah, especially for experiments that are designed for testing one particular thing, right? Thinning trials, right? You're not necessarily measuring the other things that are affecting the growth on those trials. And we often we can get into this. This is another thing that I want to talk about, is getting the climate effects out of it, but not just climate, but other effects as well. Is whenever you're not measuring your other variables of interest that are now of interest that weren't of interest, 50 years ago when these things were started, those can become complicated, especially when those trials are being used to make inferences on things like climate damages, right?
right, and I think one person who I've had the pleasure of working with, Sonja Vospernik at Boku in Vienna, is an absolute expert at teasing out these climate connections to how different species grow. And one fun thing that we've been looking at is what's the actual implication of this if we try to formulate ourselves in terms of how individual trees might grow under the climate that we've seen so far, and
Mm-hmm.
then combine this and assume that we have a sufficient spread in terms of the background levels of temperature or rainfall that might be represented in a future climate. What does this add up to in the end? What implications can this have on at a stand level? And so that's really what two of our papers that are coming out now quite soon, hopefully, will be focusing on. And it's rather interesting to see how it comes together, and when you really need a rather strong logical understanding of how you want your model to work in order to ask questions of this type.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and shout out to Sonia. She is indeed an expert. I was fortunate to meet her on a couple of occasions, and I didn't realize you were writing papers with her. I'll be very excited to see the output from that work. But this, I worked on this a little bit while I was in Norway, and none of that work ever came to fruition. But I found it to be quite difficult because, well, I think we have to take a couple of things into account. First, whenever we are developing models, we think of our independent variables as not having variance, right? But our outputs from climate models, because they're coming from stations that are not located exactly where our trials are, right?
Right.
And those have some variation as well. And we don't think about that variation often whenever we're including those variables as an independent variable in the model. Or, yeah. But the other thing is, I had a very difficult time trying to separate the responses from other variables, such as we often use age. Age is generally a description of forest structure at a certain point in time. It works quite well in monocultures. But describing a forest condition at a particular point and then teasing out the actual climate effects of that and the actual forest structure effect of that, because all of the things, density and crown structure, all of that play a huge effect on growth, right? And sometimes even more so than the particular changing climate effect, right?
Right. I definitely agree. It's like the old adage said, the most important thing you can do is decide what species to plant.
Mm.
And after that, it's down to both the capacity of the plant, but also your management. So what I think happened was that Sonia was working on a rather large data set, so the Austrian National Forest Inventory,
Mhm.
and they have recreated, as I understood it, the climate for each of these plots and connected the plots then to these very high definition local understanding of what the climate must have been like from local weather stations
Mm.
during a historical period. And then they have connected this diameter increment that would then correspond to a um, certain temperature or a certain rainfall regime,
Mm.
and try to put that into a model. And I think we're really going to be helped by more, not necessarily machine learning models, although I'd argue you could probably call it that. Just a few years ago, we're working with generalized additive models. So it's a very flexible framework for capturing extremely nonlinear relations. Um, and I think that may very well be necessary if you want to capture these type of rather fine scale differences that we're talking about.
Right, right. Do you find that that work is going to have an influence on more national policy or more on day-to-day industry management, or what do you think the effects of that work will be?
Well, I assume, and I think we're catering more towards a national policy type of target. Although what we could perhaps state in terms of at a stand or a holding level would be more in the terms of, okay, at what point do we think that it may be worth overholding a standing stock for a certain while in order to facilitate, say, a switch of species and a new species that may be perhaps less suited to frost.
Mm.
Uh, and you believe that that risk will fall significantly as you move further along into a certain scenario. And so I think we have to express everything in terms of our confidence in each type of scenario that
Right,
we are moving into then.
right. Well, one of the things that we were talking about climate effects and the models, but one of the things that we hadn't brought up yet is the, you know, general additive models, I guess, is a little bit not necessarily newer, but in scope of forest modeling, it is definitely newer in that scale. Um, but we're also adding data from kind of newer technologies such as LiDAR and remote sensing and the integration of that into our models. And one of the things that you're working on is integrating LiDAR for individual tree growth models. I'm very curious to hear about that.
Right. So this is part of the. Um, it's you could see it as a pilot project for what we would like to be running with the Eureka support system. So we have quite good or very good coverage of a lot of metrics, which are remotely sensed in Sweden. We are very fortunate to have national level laser scanning, and I understand the US has as well. And that is going to be rather high resolution. And so one of the things that we would like to show or disprove with our project would be to look at, does the additional data that is collected from very high density scannings, such as you would be able to pluck out information about the individual trees, their diameters, their crown structures, and so on, uh, can that be justified in terms of, on a national level, increasing the resolution and the significant cost in terms of storing or acquiring that data, which would accompany that? And so what we were hoping is that to develop models, at least as a pilot, for monocultures of spruce, to see if we can look at how individual trees behave towards each other or towards their local environment and neighborhood. And that is really our main kind of target with this project that's going to be coming up. And this is all, remember, coming together again in this Eureka decision support system. And it's this in turn is part of the Swedish Foundation for Strategic Environmental Research, where they're sitting down and we're saying, okay, what might our private landowners, what might our companies, and what might enterprises gain from us working together? And so in that terms, I think we have a very unique opportunity to look at how individual trees are affected by their immediate surroundings, but also in terms of the topography or the soil type or whatever other metric you may be able to measure remotely. I mean, it would be a significant cut to inventory costs if you do not have to do every single measurement possible out in the field, but you can garner quite a lot from remote sensing.
Yeah. And I think we often bin data quite significantly. For example, a stand. What is a stand? It's a a forest unit that we're going to manage in a similar way, but the variation, the individual tree variation, can be quite large within a given stand, right? And so
Right.
this remotely sensed data and then high quality remotely sensed data has the it gives us the opportunity to make more localized prescriptions and more localized management, right? But the problem that comes from that is this is now a very large data source. If you're thinking on, oh, I have a couple thousand hectares and you get, a few LiDAR scans over a couple years, that's still quite a large data set, to manage and to model, right? What, do you have
Right.
any comment on that?
It's a hard thing to have a comment on. I think there's two pieces of this problem. I think the first is that we will definitely have the opportunity to pick out areas that we believe will be of significant interest to our data collection.
Right.
So we could state that we do not perhaps need full coverage in terms of all of the things that we collect, but we could um, do it smartly.
Mhm.
We do not perhaps need to do everything at once in one big chew. We can take small bites.
Yeah, there's a company here in the US called Tree Swift. I think they have a very interesting approach to remotely sensed data collection because they are still doing traditional forest sampling. So they're putting in plots, but they're using drones to collect the data. So
Hmm.
I think it's a very interesting approach to the classical sampling problem, but it's going to, one, provide a permanent data collection sample, and two, it's going to be quite a bit more data than what we can actually collect, as people, right? Because we generally collect diameters and heights, things like tree positions and stem taper. All of that are going to be additional data that will be provided by some remotely sensed capture. But again, as you said, they're doing it more, on a smaller scale. It's not like I have to collect the whole forest. I'm still just collecting a sample. I find that to be very interesting, and I think we might see that come out from other companies as well. But I think Tree Swift has done it first, and they're at least to my knowledge, and I actually have a lot of hopes that they're going to help us to move some of this technology along.
Sure. But I think there's also room to say that we're always going to need this type of ground truth to actually validate our data, even though we might well start thinking about how accurate is the ground truth. If we have centimeter level precision on our LiDAR scans for tree heights, and we know that we might well miss by 3 decimeters standing from the ground with a clinometer.
I agree completely with what you're saying. And in my company, we do a lot of forest sampling, forest inventory work, and we always do some kind of audit. Even on our internal management, if we're doing inventory for ourselves, we always do an audit, because an audit is always important just to make sure everything's working right. Now, I agree with you to an extent. If we're measuring things to the centimeter or a tenth of a centimeter, here we use inches, but you get what I'm saying. Whereas we can get sub centimeter accuracy from LiDAR, sub height accuracy, some meter accuracy from our LiDAR. At what point is that going to be better than our actual ground truth? Well, probably pretty soon, right? But it's always good to check and make sure your sensors are working the way that we think they're working, right?
Yeah, we had a issue where we accidentally flipped the sensors that takes the tree coordinates. So as we were measuring the plots, everything became mirrored and inverted.
Yeah.
So you can get some really interesting effects if you're not looking carefully at what you are working with.
Well, and one of the things that I was talking to Dr. Mike Strube about was, getting more localized site index measurements. But, one of the issues that you have, I guess, with LiDAR is that whatever signal you're receiving doesn't necessarily hit the top of the tree, right?
No.
It's possible, but not as likely, right? So you're always kind of undersampling height a bit. What do you think about that? I mean, is it just going to be an extra model to try to move that back to, especially at the individual tree level, right? On a stand level, you could probably just take an average of the top, 90% or the top whatever percentage, right? And that will give you a good average of stand height. But at the individual tree level, now what do you do? Especially whenever you have multiple LiDAR scans over several years and you're trying to connect those 2 points.
Yeah, especially if you're using different sensors or different resolutions when comparing these scans of the same area, that becomes a problem that we've encountered in one of the things I'm working on right now. And as I understand it, our internal reports suggest that we perhaps can switch, at least for on a area-based level, switch to a more easily measured metric such as the lorry's mean height.
Yeah.
Which seems to correlate much better with certain percentiles of our laser data. However, as we move up in resolution and the amount of beams, would that be the correct term, that you send out per square meter, or your other unit of interest?
Yeah. Beams is fine. I usually talk about it in terms of signal returns. You're sending out a signal and receiving a return, but beams.
In any case, and as you increase the amount of beams or the amount of signal returns, it turns out to work out quite nicely. So you do have a rather high chance of getting rather close to the true value. But of course, it won't replace cutting the tree down and measuring it. But I think you're going to have troubles with the measuring tape too.
Yeah, right. I guess the issue there with especially depending on how you're collecting that data, the more signal returns you have per square area, the increased cost of actually collecting the data, and also the increased storage that you're going to need. Which, of course, talking to Mike Strube about, 40 years ago in Weyerhaeuser, where they couldn't even store their inventory data. They had what he called the mother function, which just was used. You develop that function to predict what's going to be on those inventory stand, like not the actual inventory, right? And now look at, we have, you can buy a 12 terabyte hard drive for, a couple $100 US, right? So it's like, maybe this problem is going to work itself out and it's not necessarily going to be a problem in 10 more years. But I always, as we add and add more data, I'm always worried about our processing capability and our storing capability, because then you take that information and you give it to your bioanalyst or your biometrician, and then we have to what? We need to run scenarios with those data. We need to project those data over long periods of time. That's going to, if you already have a very large data set and then you have to increase that, exponentially, then, well, that increases the level of complexity of the whole problem. And that's what I'm curious about at the moment is how is that going to work itself out? Well, hopefully storage and processing capabilities work themselves out. And also hopefully, this Bitcoin mining and all of that works itself out. So our GPUs come down and we don't have to pay so much for them.
Yeah, and I think we're already seeing trends of this being adapted to in terms of the programming that we're seeing. I have several colleagues who are slowly shifting or strongly advocating for languages such as Julia, which are, as I understand it, they are a nice mix of compiled and interpreted languages. So the first time you run it, it will compile, but the second time you might run the same step, it will use that previously compiled and utilize it. And so I think that we are slowly adapting to a reality of big data, if you were to put it that
Yeah,
way.
yeah, and it's interesting you bring up Julia. I have recently heard about Julia and have downloaded it, but I have not used it yet. Well,
I
so
know
I'm very
I'm a much stronger proponent of R, C++, and Python. That just about suits all of my needs for now.
yeah, and a little bit of Fortran because I have some code that's already been compiled in Fortran. So, but I'm with you there. I find over the years that R has become very efficient, very memory efficient, and the packages that are provided, the things you can get like data table and those kind of packages make it much more efficient than what it was 10 years ago. Um, I have heard in the past that kind of people that had used R for a minute and then left it have saying how slow it is, and I'm saying, well, try it again. It's gotten a lot better.
Yeah, it's certainly seen a lot of changes, especially in terms of the advocacy and work that's been put in from the POSIT group, or what was
Right.
previously our studio,
Mhm.
and also Hadley Wickham. A big shout out to him
Yeah, for
for
sure.
working so hard on the whole tidyverse uh, syntax or way of expressing yourself in a very natural way when writing your code.
Yeah, for sure. I'm a big proponent of the tidyverse. I use it quite a bit. I often have a bit of a Frankenstein in my code where I go from using tidyverse syntax to data table syntax. And there's just, it's like any tool that there's things that are good about some and things that are good about others. I like, dealing with large data sets, the way the data table just handles the data. It's just so memory efficient and so much faster in some cases. But being able to use the tidyverse in the way that it's so descriptive and to be able to chain your functions together, it makes the code readable. And so that when you pass that along to somebody, it's not so hard to look at it and go, what's happening here? No, it's very easy. You took this data, you grouped by this, and you summarized this, right? Which in the original R syntax could be quite complicated to figure out if you didn't know what you were looking at.
Yeah, I quite agree. On a side note, I think you should look that up because I think they've actually written a tidyverse kind of API for data table now, so you don't have to go through the switch in syntax.
Yeah, maybe it's better. Whenever I used it originally, there was still a little bit of overhead because you had to go through the
Oh,
tidyverse to
right.
get to the data table, and that was in the disclaimer. Like, yeah, it's not going to be as fast as data tables. And if you had functions that were running in minutes, that was fine. If you had functions that were running in hours, well, the overhead added up.
Yeah, I think my current models are taking somewhere in the order of a week or two to run, so I think that they are just about what we can manage on a workstation before we
Yeah.
might want to look into connecting to a high power computing cluster or something of the like.
I thought that there would be more options from the like Amazon workspaces. It doesn't seem so. It seems like you can get like maybe 32 gigs of RAM or something is about as high as you could get. So I really
Not
was
very much.
interesting. Yeah, it's not very much. I mean, I think I have 64 in my computer, and I was I was hitting my limits, which is what made me start looking into some cloud computing. And I was like, okay, should I build a new, computer, or should I just try to get some cloud computing? And so far, I think options are still a little bit limited in that sense. And it seems like they're used for gaming and not necessarily for analytics. If anybody knows on that, I would love to hear more if there are other options available.
I also think that we may see with some luck, we might see quite a shift to GPU-based computing, at least in terms of our models that have many functions which can very well be run in parallel.
Right.
That could be a very good option. For example, when you're projecting a holding of different stands, and you know that each spruce has the same growth function, then they could be run in parallel and not in sequence.
Yeah, exactly. I'm using parallel computing myself. I have a CPU with 21 virtual cores. I'm using 20 of them. I looked into the GPU because that's got what, a couple hundred cores or pathways or whatever you want to call it, and but I think the connection to R right now is a little bit limited. Maybe somebody who is more, from a computer science background knows a bit more about this than me. But I got into looking at it, and then I was like, okay, this is going to take way more time than I have. I'm going to just keep using the current parallel processing that I have right now, and then hopefully the tech catches up. But I agree with
The
you
old,
because
do you want to do this by hand and it'll take you 2 days, or do you want to spend 2 weeks automating it?
exactly. And that's always the issue, right? It's like, okay, but how many times am I going to have to take 2 days to do it? Is it going to be 4 weeks in the year or 6 weeks in the year? But sometimes we just don't have the time to do all of the automation that we want to do. It's just a fact of life, right?
One thing we could mention would be, right, the distance, or the connection between the end user of systems and our models and the actual modeler or the biometrician, which I think is rather interesting, because we are, so to speak, even though we're looking at very many new avenues of, for example, remotely sensed data that we would like to include, we have to make sure that these are readily accessible and not an undue burden to collect. For example, one of the things I recognize that we've been working with here is our old, we have a rather old by now, it's from 1977 and 79. Um, Lost the English word for it. We have a system in Sweden um, that estimates the site index of certain dominant or important tree species from the composition of different plants that you may have, such as the Finns have a very famous system for this that goes back all the way until 1914. I think
Mhm.
AK Kajander made it. He later became the first prime minister of Finland, if I remember correctly. But this system is dependent on a number of different variables that you need to collect in the field, such as the presence of a certain grass that may strongly indicate a certain site index for
Mhm.
a certain main species of interest. And since these are so tightly integrated with our systems, they are difficult to uh, walk away from. It becomes a sort of um, legacy that you have to deal with, such as we have and collect these different uh, data points in our national forest inventory.
Mhm.
Uh, we cannot, we're always going to keep these, perhaps we could add something, but you can't look for something that you don't already have, so as to say. So even our new models will have to include some connection to these in terms of at least ranking the site index. And I think that's important in terms of also the end user, because they may well recognize some of these quite established terms that delineate our forests, such as we have a bilberry or never mind.
Well, I I think this is also a good conversation because I have been curious about this for a time too. Because what is the meaning of side index when you have so many different changing factors? So we developed side index equations, which side index is the dominant height of a stand at a given age. How do you define the dominant height? What happens if you change the age? But at the same time, we're developing these models on you know data that come from stands that have already reached that age. So these stands have been growing under different management conditions, different climate conditions, and especially with the management's position, uh, the management, because now whenever we are making new stands, we are doing what? We're doing better site preparation. We're getting better herbaceous control. We're getting better genetics, like all of these factors. So whenever we make the concept of site index, height at a given age, we develop these high age models to describe it. Now, if we have new genetics, new management, and they hit a height at a given age, is it going to follow the same pattern as the previous stand? Probably not, right? It's probably going to have a different height growth pattern. Now, of course, we're still going to have limiting factors on our total tree height, right? They can only grow so tall in certain regions. So things like asymptotes are probably not going to change, but the rate of change and how those things grow is going to change, right? And
One
so,
classic example of this, as I understand it, is we assume the disjoint polymorphic nature of our height trajectories. That is, two curves cannot cross each other. So if you have two curves that follow along each other, they will not cross at some point. But you may well have, say, if you have different levels of physiographic regions in the same data or so, you could have a trajectory that does not follow a the other curve, but grows much faster in an initial stage and then mellows off, as opposed to following this other curve to a degree.
yeah, right. And I think a good example of this is if you apply fertilization, right? So initially getting a large level of additional nutrients going higher. So if you plot that height age on the curve, but once those nutrients, are used up, does it still continue to follow the same pathway that you have already put it on? But maybe not, right? And so the whole concept of site index for me is, it's a bit tricky. And one of the issues is that we use it in almost every single model that we have, right? Our basal area, our trees per acre, all of this includes some form of productivity that is related to site index, whether it's an actual site index or it's a height age predicted from a site index model, right?
Yeah.
Um, how is that going to work also whenever we're now using those models at an individual tree level? So
Right.
I think we still have a lot of work to do here on describing forest productivity. Um, and then whenever you add in, the whole concept of having to predict that from some kind of site factor, do I have this, species there, or I don't have this species here? What is it all going to mean? And I guess, on very large national scales, it's probably not such a huge deal, right?
Things even
Probably,
out.
Well, yeah. But if we apply it to a more localized level, if you're interested in, 10 or 15 hectares instead of, 24 million hectares, then it's maybe going to have a major effect on your projections and your potential management, right?
Right. So my family back home, when I had just graduated, or about a year into my PhD, they came to me and they said, "Hey, man, you're pretty good at this forestry stuff, right? So we have a backlot here, which was entirely felled in the big storm of January 2005, and it's all young forests now, a couple of meters high, and we've pre-commercially thinned it. And what should we do now?" And so I kind of looked at them and I went through in my head, well, what have we been talking about? What have I gone to university to do? What am I trained to tell them? I stopped and I thought and I said, I can tell you all sorts of things about how we should manage stands at large, at
Mm,
scale, but how you should manage this specific piece of land, I think you should probably go to your who you are delivering goods to. Who is going to buy your timber? They can
yeah,
tell you what they're willing to buy, and I
right.
think that was the best advice I could give them at that point.
Yeah,
Other than make sure you do your thinning not too late, rather early. Go a bit harder than you might have to. Just don't go too late.
yeah. As you've mentioned, you and I are very academic, but the one major part of forestry is the art, right? There's definitely an art, and that takes somebody
Definitely.
who's localized and working with that particular species, that particular management to make this kind of decisions. I've also had the question from my family, like, "Oh, Mickey, you're a PhD in forestry. Why is my local market so bad? Why can I not get so much money for my pulpwood?" And I'm going like, I have no idea what's going on in your local market. I don't work there. It's best for you to go talk to somebody who actually works in that market and has seen the changes and know what's going on.
And this is
And
not a new phenomenon at all. I think
yeah,
when I was looking back at how forest resources have developed in Sweden throughout the last couple of centuries, if you go back to the late 1850s when they really start talking about that there is a deficit, the Napoleonic Wars have done their part, and the landscape is more or less devoid of what you would call at least timber forests. You
mm,
have a lot of forest, but it may take a more characteristic of what you would call firewood. There's no straight, nice, big, thick stems. Nothing you could use for
right,
timber or for preferably for naval ships. Or,
mhm, right, exactly,
and so what you can see is that once you reduced your local resources to firewood, they realize that, well, you can't ship them anywhere. Firewood has no real value. It's not worthwhile to haul it for large distances, especially even if you have a mine or you have uh, some furnace of some sort that needs to be fed with fuel wood. It's difficult to haul it a particularly long way because it loses so much value.
yeah,
And uh, this seems to hold true even today, that timber is a very lowly refined resource, and there's not a lot of value in the timber itself compared to the end products that we create. And
right,
so this is one aspect of that. And what you can see today is that you are very much bound to your local market in terms of what they are willing to buy. And even if you are willing to produce a very niche assortment of, say, high quality fine hickory that you've tended to for 150 years, well, okay, you're probably going to find someone who wants to buy that, but you're going to have to look apart a bit for them.
right,
And I think that's a issue that's being discussed a lot now at the European level, that you want to create, at least in Europe, we want to have a rather top-down control on national management recommendations which are given. So in Sweden, we have a very rotation-oriented forest management system,
Mhm.
and this has come under rather harsh and sometimes unfair, in my opinion, although that's entirely my view, critique from the European Union, and particularly countries in which they are much more used to delivering perhaps many different sortiments from a single stand, or you have a very different price differentiation for your goods
Mhm.
than a country such as Sweden, which has built up its forest management around an industry that is very much volume oriented. Because make no mistake, we forestry is a response to an industry need.
Right.
Otherwise, there's no need to have forestry. There's
Mhm.
very little chance that you as an individual would perhaps have difficulties using up all the wood in your local forest. But once you start building a society from those goods, you're going to have to ask a lot more of that, and you're going to have to start managing it in certain ways. And
Yeah.
once you've created an industry that needs to be fed, then you'll have limited options in what directions you can take as a nation.
Yeah. And it's quite interesting because, especially if you think about national scale policy, you want to move in a certain direction, and you're kind of forecasting what the conditions are going to be at a certain point in time, but those conditions change. I think one interesting example is in Norway, where they were heavily involved in what they had 11 or 12 like fine paper mills that they were making like newspaper print and these kind of specialty papers. And then, of course, what happened? Well, our technology advanced and our tablets came and our cell phones came, and now we read our news on the internet and we don't buy newspapers or magazines anymore. And so now I think they have maybe two pulp mills in the country, or two paper mills in the country that is producing this kind of specialty paper, right? That's an interesting example, but we always take the risk that whenever we're, for example, at the smallest scale, planning a new stand, we're planning based on a market condition that we are kind of forecasting it to be, right? So we plan a certain number of trees per acre. We want to get them to be a certain size to meet a certain product, right? You made the interesting example of planting hickory for some specialty product and managing it for 150 years. You're just kind of hoping at the end that that investment pays off, right? Um, I think it's very curious at how these things are handled at a national scale whenever you're trying to implement policy, because much of this policy is based on the current condition of today, and we try to do some speculation, but whenever you're speculating over 100 years, you're never going to get it right at the end.
Particularly when you're looking across such a diverse domain as the European Union, you have very different outlooks in terms of uh, both what is socially accepted for how you can manage your forests,
Mhm.
but also in terms of what species you have, what goods you deliver, and all of these differences add up when you try to set a cross national kind of guideline. It
Mhm.
becomes very difficult, especially when there's very many very strong interests involved from
Mhm.
different directions,
Yeah.
and there is a strong hope that perhaps an over reliance on that many of the lessons learned in other countries can be easily transferred to different locations, which I do not believe to be necessarily true.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And something that you mentioned before that we haven't talked about is, kind of financial or biodiversity credits, carbon credits. These kind of things are quite interesting how they're affecting our markets and our policies. Um, I think that uh, it's very interesting to see how things have so quickly evolved and how that they are going to evolve in the future. And I think seeing where we are now and where we were 10 years ago, I don't know if that I would have projected that we would be where we are. And so saying that, and of course, I'm not the expert in these type of projections, but where are we going to be in 10 years? Where are we going to be in 50 years? Whenever this is actually, these policies that are being put in place are having huge effects on the current management. And I'll say in the US, the idea of the carbon credit is that you defer harvest for a certain number of time, try to build up the level of carbon in the forest. Well, what happens whenever we have an overpopulation of trees, right? Whenever our stands become too dense, we get things like forest fires, we get things like beetle outbreaks. Particular if you have poor stem form, you can get much more damages from things like hurricanes and frost and those kind of things. So you and I are not going to answer the question today, but it's a very interesting thing, and how this is going to be, these national policies that are going to be put into place are going to have an effect on forest management on a national scale and even on a worldwide scale.
I think it's very important to note that both you and I, as I understand it, are foresters by training and by profession. So we're trained to think of decadal and sometimes up to 100 or 200 years, or perhaps even 300 years if you're stretching it time scale. But when talking to policymakers, it's very difficult to explain that the landscape that we are living in today is dominated by decisions that are taken decades or half a century before us, and
Right.
we just have to live with that. We cannot change that overnight, no matter how much they would like to do
that.
Yeah. And in turn, what we do today will have a profound impact, not today, but in 50, 60 years.
Very true. Carl, I think this has been a wonderful conversation. I think that's a good note to end on. I really enjoyed this podcast. I really enjoyed getting to talk to you. It's been so fun. We got to do it again sometime. My only question for you, I have one more, is what do we got to do to get you over here to the US?
Oh, I'll have to think about that one.
Yeah, well, if you're ever looking for a job, give me a call. That's for sure.
Will do.
All right, man.
All right, then.
Thanks.
Stay good. See you around.
Well, again, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. It was so much fun talking with Carl, and I just wish him the best of luck in his future career. For the future, if there's any graduate students that would love to be on the podcast, or if you are an advisor who has a grad student that you would like to be on the podcast, just send them my way. I would love to meet you and to host you and to have a wonderful conversation. So until next time, thanks everybody. Ciao.